Is the 5-year TIPS a buy at this week's upcoming auction? And what about the 20-year T-bonds? Hello members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. Here are the 3 topics that we'll be covering in today's update video. 1. Does the upcoming 5-year TIPS auction look attractive? And who might consider picking some up? 2. Were Treasury yields up again this past week? And 3. What's on the upcoming Treasury auction schedule? And where can you find the best opportunities with new issue agencies, corporates, and brokered CDs now? In this section of today's video, we'll also be looking at the upcoming 20-year T-bond in more detail. And as usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. If you're new to us or to inflation-protected bonds, TIPS stands for Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. I've linked our TIPS videos in the first pinned comment below for your convenience. And if you're in our Bond Beginners course, please refer back to Module 6 on TIPS, as well as this replay of Friday's live online course session for more details on anything that I'm about to talk about in this section of today's video. So, this coming Thursday, October 24th, 2024, the Treasury will auction off $24 billion of new issue 5-year TIPS. And yes, it's a nice numerical coincidence, $24 billion on the 24th of October 2024. And yes, that's also what gives us here at Diamond NestEgg a bit of a chuckle. In any case, an original issue auction for the 5-year TIPS only happens twice every year. So, it is something to watch if you're a real bond fan, as we undoubtedly are. Here's where the 5-year TIPS closed at this past Friday. And here's what the expected coupon and yield are at the time of this taping on Fidelity's platform. Keep in mind that these numbers can and usually do change all the way up to the time of the auction. Now, as I shared in our live Bond Beginners course session, the 5-year TIPS yield remains attractive in my mind. Yes, it has come down a bit since October of last year and even from May of this year, but it is still significantly higher than it has been over the past 15 years, since 2009. But what about the break-even inflation rate, you might ask? The inflation rate above which will prove a good investment to have bought these 5-year TIPS versus a non-inflation protected 5-year T-note. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the 5-year TIPS closed at 1.65% this past Friday. Remember that TIPS are quoted on a real yield basis, meaning that this number is already adjusted for inflation. So an investor who owns this TIPS will always stay 1.65% ahead of inflation. As I always say to those of you familiar with I-bonds, think of the real yield as the fixed rate on an I-bond, which currently stands at 1.3%, by the way. The 5-year Treasury note closed at 3.88%. Treasury bills, notes, and bonds are quoted on a nominal yield basis, not adjusted for inflation, meaning that to make these two numbers comparable, we actually have to deduct the rate of inflation from this nominal yield to get to the real yield. Now, if we take this nominal yield here of 3.88% and subtract out the real yield here of 1.65%, we get 2.23%. This is the break-even inflation rate, meaning that if inflation stays at a constant rate of 2.23% every year for the next 5 years, it makes no difference whether you buy these 5-year TIPS or these 5-year Treasury notes. Because at an average inflation rate of 2.23%, both the TIPS and the Treasury note will deliver you the same 3.88% nominal yield and the same 1.65% real yield over their lifetimes. And if inflation is under 2.23% on average over the next 5 years, then these 5-year Treasury notes would have been more prudent. Because remember, the inflation adjustment on the TIPS will be smaller if inflation remains lower, while the Treasury will continue to pay its 3.88% coupon rate throughout its life. On the other hand, if inflation will be above 2.23% on average over the next 5 years, then these 5-year TIPS would have been the wiser investment. Because in this case, the TIPS inflation adjustment would go up to compensate for the higher inflation, whereas the coupon of the Treasury would again stay unchanged, meaning you'd start falling behind inflation. You should know that this break-even inflation rate of 2.23% is a bit higher than the 5-year average of 1.92% that we've seen since 2009. But of course, this did include the last decade before COVID, when both inflation and interest rates were relatively low. As a reminder, the latest CPIU report showed inflation running at 2.4%. Put another way, while I personally think the 5-year TIPS yield remains attractive currently, if you don't think that inflation will be higher than this break-even inflation rate on average for the next 5 years, then the upcoming TIPS auction may not be for you. If, on the other hand, you do think that inflation will be higher than this break-even inflation rate on average for the next 5 years, and the maturity fits your timeline and goals, plus you fully understand how TIPS work, then picking up some in this week's upcoming auction might make sense. Now that we've covered the inflation-protected part of today's video, let's move on to the non-inflation protected part and see how Treasury bills, notes, and bonds fared last week. As we so often do at the end of the week, let's compare Treasury yields from this past Friday versus the previous week. Here we have all the maturities that the Treasury issues at auction. Here's where yields stood this past Friday, and here's where yields stood at the end of the previous week. Compared to the previous week, yields were basically stable overall across most maturities, with the 6-month, the 1-year, and the 3-year moving up by only 1 basis point, and at the very extreme ends, the 1-month and the 30-year moving down slightly. Now, let's take a look at Treasury yields from this past Friday versus the beginning of this year. This row shows where rates ended this past Friday. This row shows where rates were on January 2nd. And this row shows the increase or decrease in rates since the beginning of this year to the time of this taping. Increases in rates are shown in black and decreases in rates are shown in red. Treasury yields across all short and medium maturities through the 5-year are still noticeably lower than where they were at the start of the year. Treasury yields on the long end, though, continue to be above where they were on January 2nd of this year. You can find more details on these rates for any day of the week that the bond market is open on the Treasury's daily Treasury par yield curve rates page. All sources are linked below in the first pinned comment. Do keep in mind that this overview gives you a general feeling for where rates currently stand along the maturity spectrum. The yields that you may get when you buy at a specific auction or from a specific broker, or when you sell, will likely differ a little bit from what's shown here. Now that we've covered Treasury yields from this past week, let's move on to the next section of this video, especially for those of you who are interested in agencies, corporates, and brokered CDs as well. Here we are at Treasury Direct's upcoming auctions page. If we scroll down, we can see that all the weekly T-bill and CMB auctions are happening as usual. And if we scroll down further, we can see the 20-year T-bond and the 5-year TIPS will be auctioned off as well this upcoming week, as we already discussed earlier. The 20-year T-bond is a reopening auction, so we already know what the coupon will be on that. The 5-year TIPS is not a reopening auction, so the coupon on that will be determined on auction day. At the time of this taping, here's what the coupon and the expected yield are for the 20-year T-bond auction on Fidelity's platform. And here's what the coupon and the expected yield are for the 5-year TIPS, as we already shared before. As we often say, do keep in mind that all of these numbers can and usually do change all the way up to the time of the auction. For those of you who may be interested in the 20-year T-bond, this chart may be useful. Yields on the 20-year T-bond remain at some of the highest levels when compared over a 15-year period, as you can see here. So that was Treasuries. For those of you who may be interested in other types of bonds and CDs for a bit of a higher yield potentially, here's where the highest yielding new issue agency bonds stand at the time of this taping. For corporate bonds, here's where the highest yielding new issues stand at the moment. And yes, there is a fairly long list to choose from once again, and many with a 5 handle even. Like our highest yielding offering on the list, this Deutsche Bank 20-year note with a 5.75% coupon. If you're interested in brokered CDs, here's where the highest yielding new issues are currently. Remember that regardless of whether we're talking about agency bonds, corporate bonds, or brokered CDs, Currently, the higher yielding ones that are a bit further out in terms of maturity are generally callable, but do make sure to check when the first call date is, as some of them might be quite a bit longer than others. All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And if you want to really get up to speed on bond investing and building out your bond portfolio while rates are still attractive, then check out this video here on our 2024 bond courses. Or come join our next live YouTube member Q&A on Sunday, October 27th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time, where we'll be discussing the 2, 5, and 7-year T-note auctions. I've also linked all the details on our bond courses and YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. Good luck to everyone who's planning on picking up some bonds and or CDs this coming week. And see you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.